Hi everyone, welcome to yet another edition of Metaflow Office Hours. We have a very special presentation today. Our presenter today is Kaushal Kundalia. Kaushal is currently a research assistant in the ML engineering team, I guess, at Santa Clara University. He before this he was a software engineer at Fiddler, at Deep Blue Inc. And prior to that he was a research intern at Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, India. He has a very interesting use case of using Metaflow for disease forecasting and similar other kind of health related domains and health related data. We've seen some of these kinds of presentations before, but this is the first time we're seeing one from a university that is working in collaboration with a company. So, Kaushal, over to you. Would love to hear more about how you're using Metaflow and how it works.
Yep, let me share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So, hey, thank you so much for the kind words, Shri. So, as you mentioned, I'm currently a master's student in computer science at Santa Clara University. And today I'm going to talk about how we're using Metaflow at our research lab. So, little bit of the background of what we do. So, our lab is called Epidemic Vision, or short form eVision Lab. And we're a research lab at Santa Clara University, funded by Cepheid Incorporation, which is basically a leading molecular drug, a molecular prediction company from Sunnyvale. At eVision, our primary focus is to have supplementary diagnosis for disease forecasting. So we basically try to use social media trends and wastewater samples and stuff like that to forecast disease trends in the future. We're an interdisciplinary team of students majoring in data science, computer science, and bioengineering. Now, my role at the lab is sort of an engineer role, wherein I help the research people to build their models and also to build them to scale and to deploy. So this is what we have worked on. What you see in front of your screen is our model's prediction. So it is basically predicting the number of influenza cases over a span of 60 weeks. You can see the blue line. The blue line actually represents the actual data, and the red solid line is what our model is predicting. And we are using trends from Google and Twitter, which is called X now. And a shameless plug that if you find our work interesting, then do check out our website. It is on the screen. We have a lot of publications already, and we have a lot more coming in the pipeline. So a
So,
quick overview.
sorry. Can I ask you a quick question? If you go
Yeah,
back
sure.
to the last slide. So the red line is, sorry, the blue line is the actual ground truth that you found out later, and the red solid line was what you had predicted up front. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Awesome. Cool. Go ahead.
Mhm. So quickly giving you an overview of our workflow. So we have scheduled ETL pipeline that basically aggregates data from various sources in the internet. We have about like 35 different websites right now from which we're collecting and aggregating our data. All this data is dumped into on AWS RDS. Then from there, we kind of have two different workflows that serve different use cases. In the bottom, you can see the model development workflow, which is nothing but where the models are actually developed by the data scientists. So here, data scientists, they mostly work on a simple, smaller set of data, which they try to model on their, personal system. And once they have enough confidence on their model, they deploy it onto a cloud EC2 instance. We have reserved like a few GPU instances on which we train our model for full scale, because the kind of models that we deal with, it's kind of infeasible to do it locally on your system. So we use cloud compute to train our model full scale. Once the models are trained, they go into the next pipeline that is called production. Here production has a little bit of a different meaning than what we usually use in the industry. So here the models are not served via an API, or they're not customer facing models, but these models are scheduled to run every 3 weeks to check how they're evaluating and to check their performance on what the model is predicting. when the model goes into prediction, we do not touch the model a lot unless there's some, hyperparameter tuning required or stuff like that. But it's minor changes. That's why we name this stage as production. This is like fairly simple, pipeline, if you may, in terms of data processing. So, obviously, you might think that, so what are the pain points that we face and why do we need to use Metaflow at the first place? And surprise, surprise, we face challenges at every stage of the pipeline. So, starting with the model development part, there's a lot of gap between the local environment on which the data science work on and how the cloud environment looks like. And obviously we can't expect the data scientists to have the prior knowledge or to also invest the time to make sure their notebooks are production ready to be run on cloud, because that's not what their purpose is for. So that creates a bottleneck. So because now you have to have someone else who has to do all the heavy lifting, which is kind of my role right now. So this is like one of the bottlenecks in existing system. Coming to production, since these models are scheduled to run on every 3 weeks interval of time, and we also need to have a lot of visibility on how the model is performing, right? So if it's like just a basic cron job or something like that, then you have a lot of failure points. The model could fail. You might not have visibility on what is failing. You'll have to like fetch logs to get all the data to see the different matrices. So that was also like the another pain point for us. There's something that is common in between these two workflows, and that is experiment tracking. So experiment tracking is one of the most crucial part when we're doing research, because we need to justify what worked and what did not work in our paper. Until now, experiment tracking was mostly done manually, which is, to be honest, not a lot of work. But when you're running like one or two experiments every day, then this little work piles up, and it's a lot of work if do accumulation. So we kind of yeah. So moving on. So we're basically a team of like we're a small team, but at any time we're working with like at least 15 to 16 different models at a time. And to increase the complexity more, each of this model has a different variant that is basically trained on a data set from different region. So the architecture is the same, but the data on which it is trained is different. So it's, you could imagine, right, that we have so much manual work that's going on in our workflows. At the same time, we have large number of model artifacts that we need to take care of. And because of this, we realized sort of three pain points at our system, which was kind of bottlenecking our productivity. So the number one was the gap between local and cloud training. The second one was experiment tracking, and the third one was scheduling, training, and evaluation. These bottlenecks are basically because we have like a lot of models to deal with, and we did not have enough automation to rely on. Now, if you break down this, bottlenecks or these problems that we're facing, then fundamentally these are like the same problem that we as software engineers face. But as software engineers, we have like very mature tools around it. So for, we have like CI/CD pipeline that basically, minimizes the uh, gap between local development and production. Then we have, we have Git for version tracking, and we have like a lot of orchestrator and schedulers available. So we realized that we did not have any such mature tooling for our use case at our lab. And that's how, we ended up using Metaflow, and Metaflow actually helped us in addressing most of this bottlenecks that we had. Now, how we're using Metaflow at our research lab. So this is a pretty basic, implementation of Metaflow on AWS. So I used cloud formation to get things running on the infrastructure side on infrastructure. And then I just, use Metaflow to configure AWS with Metaflow. And we are primarily using S3 for artifact storage, and then ECS and batch to trigger our jobs, and step function to schedule our workflows. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit more about the challenges that we faced and how Metaflow helped us with that. So, number one was the gap between, the local environment and the cloud environment. And a good amount of my time before Metaflow was actually spent in converting the Jupyter notebooks into scripts, then containerizing them, and then deploying, like pushing it to ECR, and then running the ECS job, which was like a lot of repetitive manual work. And I also yeah, like so it was a lot of repetitive work. So after using Metaflow, it actually expedited the process from several hours to almost instantly. And the good part about this was that the control now resided in the hands of the data scientists. So I did not have to interfere in between unless they had like some issues with provisioning the clusters or something like that. But for most of the part, they were pretty, autonomous on how they're you know how they're like building their model and how they are training full scale, which was like a big win for us since we saw like significant boost in productivity. Then moving on, the next challenge is related to managing model artifacts. So as I mentioned earlier, that we had, like we had different models for different diseases, and we had different variants of model that are trained on different, regional data. Now the problem is that right. So anyways, yeah. So we have like data coming in from three different countries, and we have data for almost every state of these countries, right? So technically, we have all the data. Now, ideally, we would want to train one variant of each model for all the state data that we have, but because of our limitations of because of our tooling limitations around artifact management, and because most of the things were done manually, we could only prioritize a few states for each of the model. And which is kind of a good example to see where lack of tooling not only hindered our productivity but also limited the scope of work that we could do. So anyways, as a solution to this, we started using for each catch and retry operator of Metaflow. Now, the difference between having written your own script versus using for each catch and Metaflow is quite significant. So for starters, we did write a rudimentary script that basically loops over different geographical region and tries to train models for this. But then this is not a very optimal solution, because for starters, you don't have parallelism here. All the tasks are unsequentially. Then you need to make sure that things don't fail, and one crash does not take down your entire workflow that is running so far, and you do not lose earlier data. So you need to like make proper robust code for that. Whereas we realized that using for each just abstracted everything away, and with for each we could leverage parallelism. Then we had more visibility inside the logs, because we could now query the tasks that are running using the Metaflow client. So we had more visibility, and we could also build more robust pipelines since we had like the catch operator. So even if like a couple of tasks failed for cities in between, we would feel confident that everything else would definitely work for sure, which we were not so much when we were using our own script to iterate over the loop. As a result of that, now we're able to work with 106 unique model artifacts, which is like a big win for us, which was like hardly around like 5 or 10 artifacts at a time when things were done manually. And using for each also opened like a new possibility for us. So for example, let's say if we have like one model for one city, like if we have a pipeline for one model and one city, then we could just with minor modification, we could essentially use the same script to support like all the cities in a state or all the states in a country. So that was also a good win, which was like ease of use. Moving on to the next point is scheduling. So as I mentioned earlier, since we were working with time series data, it is important to periodically run the models to check for the staleness and to also evaluate performance. Now, we initially, like before Metaflow, we had cron job set up, but then cron jobs did not give us a lot of visibility on what failed. And also, it was like extra step for the data science folks to log into AWS Cloud Watch Console and then try to debug what's failing and what's going wrong. So after that, since we faced this, we decided to use Metaflow's schedule decorator. And with the schedule decorator, a lot of things changed. And you can see on the right how we have now one workflow that is scheduled to run every week. And because, you could query the different variables that are stored while your workflow has run. So now the data science folks could actually use the Metaflow client to see how the model performed over a period of time. And it also provided us with an implicit experiment or version tracking as well. Now, because of this, things become much faster because now, let's say if you're a data scientist, you query a model, you see your model is not performing well, then you could just fire up, you could pull the model artifact from S3, which artifact it is pointing at. You could pull that up. You could retrain the same artifact by using the earlier training, workflow that you already have. So overall, it minimized our time quite a lot from debugging the model, scheduling, and to training the model periodically. And next step is about experiment tracking. So I feel experiment tracking is one of like the salient features of Metaflow, which at our organization actually helped most of the people get on board and start using Metaflow because things were so implicit and under the hood for tracking your model performance. Since everything is done under the hood, you don't have to manually maintain an Excel of how your model is performing for each run, which we used to do earlier, right? So this was like basically the selling point that people realize that if I can, just run my model and if the performance is tracked automatically inside a database, then that's a big win for me. And we also noticed that people were using local runs for Metaflow over Jupyter notebooks, again because they did not want to do the extra step of documenting all the model performance on the Excel. There's actually one interesting story around experiment tracking and scheduling that I want to talk about. So we had like two different models that used to predict like the trends in tuberculosis. So one model used to take input from Google Trends and keywords data, and the other model used to take complex molecular proportions from waste samples. So we had collaborated with the Santa Clara County, and they used to provide us with the readings from waste sample. Now, this both these models were, put into the scheduling script into production, and then we were evaluating how these models are performing compared to each other. And we noticed one interesting pattern that the model that was, running on the waste, that was, making predictions from the waste water from local counties. That model actually underperformed every fixed interval of time. Like I think once in every week, that model used to underperform for some reason, which was weird since we saw like a pattern in model, in model prediction. We investigated further. We realized that there were a few complex molecules in the data set that we were getting that were also following a similar pattern. So we realized that there's something wrong with the data that is coming in. So we contacted the Santa Clara County, and then they investigated with the lab with who was sending us the result. And turns out that one of the containers that was used to take the water samples, so the container was not like cleaned properly, and since the containers were used in cycles, we could see that spike every cycle when the container was used. So that was kind of an interesting example to see how experiment tracking helped us debug our model pipeline like in real life. Yeah, so moving on, another plus point about Metaflow that helped us is extensibility. So Metaflow is not very opinionated, fortunately, on what kind of stack you're supposed to use or how you're supposed to design your workflows, which actually helped us a lot. And the reason is that recently we expanded the scope of our whole lab and our project to also do ECG compression, ECG signal compression models. And these models are totally different than the disease forecasting models that we have. Now, with these models, the artifacts are totally different. The way we train our model is different since we're using like a UNet CNN-based architecture. The type of data that is coming is also totally different, and the pre-processing required is also totally different. Fortunately, Metaflow is not very opinionated and it supports like a plethora of third-party libraries, since like Metaflow is essentially basic Python scripts. So we could like pretty much incorporate anything that we want. And since our team is already familiar with Metaflow, there's not another learning curve or not another tool that is added to your requirements.txt file. So yeah, anyways, this was pretty much the challenges and how Metaflow helped us combat these challenges. And now I'll talk about the impact that it had on our organization. So obviously things were much faster and iterations were much slower. At the same time, since data scientists had more autonomy, they could, they had more control, they could experiment more. And I assume it resulted in better, research, but it's hard to quantify when you're doing research. So these were like few, immediate and visible impact. But besides that, there are also some broad impact that we realized after a few months we started or we fully moved to Metaflow. So we noticed that even the data scientists, they increasingly started to use Git more. And the reason is that since it became easier for them to, deploy model to production, moving from like a notebook file to a Python file was lot easier. And now these data scientists were more reliant on the Python file to even locally run their model and also train. So naturally, Git was an extension to that for version tracking. They started to use Git more. Then secondly, we also saw that all the artifacts which earlier used to reside on like, people's personal computer, or most of the artifacts were like shared via email. Things slowly started to centralize to our S3 bucket. And again, this is because Metaflow, it does like the, artifact management by itself. And it gives like a good abstraction layer via its client, wherein you can interact with your artifacts. So now you don't have to worry about artifacts anymore. And then people sort of, just defaulted to using S3 and using, centralized artifacts now, which is obviously very important for any company, since you wouldn't want to be reliant on, one person have a data on their system. Another side effect or maybe another positive effect from these two above mentioned topic is that people started to put in more efforts in documentation, which is also like an interesting trend that I saw at our at our research lab. So earlier what used to happen is that people used to document what experiments they're performing and what hyperparameters and stuff they're doing, but all this documentation was mostly on Google Docs. And then they had like a separate, notebook or separate Python script wherein they did all their experimentation. And these two things would, go out of sync pretty quick because the rate of experimentation is pretty quick. But now that people started to use Git more, people also started to document their work in, markdown files in the same repository. And now since like, the file resides in the same directory as, where you're coding, and also everything goes into the same commit. So people sort of found it easier to keep all these two things in track, and hence people naturally gravitated towards using markdown for documentation. And I also saw that people started to put more efforts on how they're writing what they're writing in order to make it as easy to understand. And I think this is because now that people know that their work is, visible to everyone in the lab, so they want to make it easier for others to, also pick up from the work that they've done. So it was another interesting, use case or that I saw at our, at our lab. And besides that, we saw that we overall gained a lot of maturity as a team, as our processes were more well defined now. Things were more autonomous, and we could rely on tooling rather than doing things manually. So as a conclusion, we could incorporate some of the software engineering best practices within our data science team without actually compromising with the velocity at which the data scientists work. Yeah, I think that concludes my presentation, and I'm open for questions.
This is excellent, man. This is really good. One question here. So, did you have visibility into what were the actions taken after you shared the results with either Santa Clara County or Cepheid or any other city? Because you mentioned multiple cities.
Mhm.
So when you shared the results, Like the first slide that you showed, the red line, the prediction of I think influenza cases.
Yeah.
So who was it shared with, and like what action did they take? Do you know?
So it was shared with like Cepheid, and we actually published a paper on this, which was published in IEEE.
Okay.
So these are like mostly research, initiatives. So I don't think there's any like, use case that we could share it with someone, but this was mostly
Mhm.
done on research purposes.
I see. And then on Cepheid side, like I know they provide. I mean, they make medicines essentially, right? So did they? Do you know if they use this data for actually kind of sort of like sending medicines to certain medicines to certain cities or counties or some such thing? Again, it
So
doesn't have to be. I'm just curious.
yeah, so eventually that was the like purpose of initiating this research
Sure.
at our lab. So we are actually working on building a tool that basically is like a GUI for that is dedicated for Cepheid folks, wherein they could put in a state, they could put in what date they would want, and then the model would give you the prediction, which is like a later phase, but we first want to
Sure.
focus on research for
Yeah.
now. That is
Absolutely.
in the pipeline.
Awesome. Very good. Very good. Other people, questions?
I have a question. Thanks, Sri. Hey, great presentation, Kaushal. So, can you talk a little bit about the dimensions of the data and how big of a data
Mm.
volume that you were dealing with while solving this problem?
Yeah. So we had different dimensions of data. So I can give you a few examples. So for example, talking about the tuberculosis data. So we had data coming in daily from, I think, all the 50 states in the United States. And specifically, we had around 17 counties in California from which we were getting like daily trends data. Now, what I mean by trends data is that how much these influenza and its related keywords were put on Twitter, how much is put on Google. And I think there was this one more site which I'm not able to recall, but that was mostly like a medical question asking site where you could ask, medical FAQs. So basically our data science team had recognized a bunch of keywords. I think there were like 35, 36 keywords in total that they would be looking for at different social media, and the data would be coming in daily for different geographic location. And then we had data scraped from CDC every day. Now CDC maintains a public health record of how much TB cases are there, and CDC has again city-wise data sorted out. So we had like that data that was our prediction column. Talking about ECG or the recent project that we are doing. So in ECG, our data is actually coming in from a large corpus of sensors they have. It's the data is about like 2 TBs of data, so it's like massively large scale data. And the data is like sampled at 25 to 50 hertz. So again, a lot of signals, and to deal with that, we're considering using PySpark to process the data. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely gives a ballpark in terms of the volume. Oh, thanks. And,
Yeah.
and and did you have a dedicated Spark cluster? Because obviously medical data set, I've heard there is a ton of sparsity that typically comes along with that. So did your team manage to also have a dedicated Spark cluster tied with Metaflow to run the show, or did you do them in memory, all the pre-processing cases? So
Yeah,
how
so
did
we're, yeah, so we're still, working on the Spark integration with, Metaflow. So I'm actually, trying to figure out, I'm new to Spark, so I'm trying to figure out Spark for now, how to get things, running. And after that, we're going to integrate it with Metaflow. Talking about your concern for health or patients' data, this data that we got, we received like the data from some public source, so we do not need to worry so much about confidentiality for now. So we could like use Kubernetes or dedicated Spark cluster as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, one.
That helps.
Awesome. Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I have one question. It might be a bit left field, but just out of interest, because it's a problem that we face sometimes is like, do you have like large disparity in the resource requirements that you need for all these different models in the for each? And if so, do you have like a nice way of managing the different resource requirements? Because kind of a common problem that we see is that we have, say, 15 different models for like maybe 15 different cities, but actually some of the cities are a lot bigger, and then we have some jobs running on smaller cities where the resource requirements are just massively provisioned. It'd be nice to kind of have a way to
Yeah,
kind of
that's a good point. So we have sort of bifurcated all our cities into like three chunks. So number one are the bigger cities, and our primary focus is to accurate our model predictions for these bigger cities. So for the bigger cities, most of the time we do not use like for each, because these cities we have like customized feature for these bigger cities. I think there are like 5 or 6 of them, that have a certain threshold of population. Talking about, mid to smaller cities, they could, by the clusters that we have provisioned, we did not face any problem running for each job on the smaller scale cities. So, yeah, I mean, that's a good point that we need to consider if we are just throwing everything all together once. But fortunately, that's not the case with us.
Quick question here about use of GPUs and stuff. Like, I saw in one of the examples that you showed, there were use cases for GPUs. Did you have to use GPUs in any of these cases or any of these models?
Yeah, so to give you a bit of detail, our models right now that we're working on is kind of an ensemble model of Markov chain, Monte Carlo, and also LSTM models. Now, Markov chain Monte Carlo, it actually runs a lot faster on GPUs, around 53 times faster on GPUs than on CPU. So we had to, provision GPUs for that, and without that, we would like infinite time to train the algorithm. So for LSTM, like not so much, but since we're provisioning, so we're also, training it over that.
Awesome.
Yeah, I could have a few questions as well.
Mhm.
First of all, on the Git usage. So you mentioned that the data scientists they're using it for just version control. Do you have any plans on integrations on top of Git, like a GitOps workflow or something, or is it just for version control? And then, as a follow-up question, for one of the others, any features that you're currently lacking in Metaflow that you'd like to see in the future?
Mhm. Yeah, so answer your first question, we don't really plan to have any kind of GitHub action or integration, because like we just don't need it for now. Don't want to unnecessarily complicate by over engineering. To answer your second question, I was actually talking to Shri about it, that if Metaflow could have, caching provisions, at least especially when we're doing, compute heavy tasks, then that would be great. If you could understand like the parameters that haven't changed, then pretty much the data should also be the same.